So if you have a little look at this slide, and I think perhaps, and then also a little look at this next slide. And so these were two things to keep in mind perhaps during this short presentation, which we can come back to later if that works. So I'm hoping to talk a little bit about the Reading Aloud directive, which was actually at the same time as the Brexit directive in 2017, wasn't it? It was sent out together, and the role it played within a larger project examining reading aloud. So I had a project, an AHRC funded project, that's the Arts and Humanities Research Council, 2017 to 2019, called Reading Aloud in Britain Today. And it aimed, in a sense, quite simply to find out whether adults read aloud, what, where, how. We as adults may read aloud across the country, so across Scotland, Wales and England, and listen to others reading and why. And so maybe a tiny bit of background about why I pursued this project. As an adult literacy teacher and also as a reading researcher and just as a member of public, I'd come to feel that when we talk about reading for adults, we tend to assume we're talking about silent reading, individual reading. And indeed, if you look up reading aloud online, you will find lots of things telling us you must read to your children, but very little else, very little about the reading that adults may do, which is allowed. And yet, anecdotally, if you talk to people, all kinds of stories come out about the different forms of reading we may do using our voices. But these are often, I think, obscured beneath this sense that reading for adults is silent reading. And if you look in the past, there's scholars who talk about 1,000 years ago, the situation was reversed. Reading, in the various words we used in different languages, tended to mean reading aloud, and silent reading was much less usual. Most scholars, though, do think silent reading was coexisting with reading aloud as well. But in a similar situation to today, there was a kind of dominant understanding of what reading meant, which then obscured the diversity of practices beneath it. So that's what I tried to do in this study, is just to gather experiences from people in different ways about when we might read out loud and why. And so in terms of the design of the whole project, mass observation was one part of a three-part research design that also included a survey, which was mainly online with some hard copies, and it also included interviews, face-to-face interviews, and also recordings of people reading out loud in different contexts. So just to give a tiny bit from the survey, there's certainly lots I could say in a longer presentation about the sampling, because certainly it would have been hard to get anyone to fill in the survey who hated reading. The survey was, though, called Everyday Reading. It wasn't called Reading Aloud. And it certainly wasn't filled in by a group of people who were all mad about reading aloud. But it's not a completely representative survey in many ways. But from these, so there's about 600 to 700 people in all who filled in nearly all of the survey. The demographics, the people who filled in all the demographics were 529 or so, which were the ones we used for some of the analysis. But certainly it showed that reading aloud is something that does happen. So the majority of people did some form of reading aloud, whether weekly or monthly, and very few did none. Perhaps more interestingly, it was very diverse. So lots of talking about reading from newspapers, so social media posts, graffiti from toilet doors, reading to learn languages, reading to memorize, reading to write, reading as forms of different types of worship, and of course reading aloud for different purposes. So some of it was about this sharing or teaching others or as a service to others, but many was a kind of very individual thing, to learn something, to write something, to memorize something, and then practices which were for the pleasure or the experience of that reading. There was also quite a lot said in the survey about reading aloud in different languages, including languages that those reading aloud in it didn't speak or use for other purposes. So one example of this are the religious practices, where someone may read aloud in Quranic Arabic but not speak Arabic. But there are also instances of people talking about reading aloud in Old Norse, for example, because it's a language they learned at one point. It's part of their identity, what they like to do, or in French. That was the survey bit. the mass observation, which is what I'm here mainly to talk about. In thinking about the mass observation, I was very influenced by this article, and I don't know if some of you probably know it quite well, where Kramer talks about different types of duality that are part of a mass observation. And it was very interesting in the previous presentation, the sense that a mass observation can get beneath assumptions, I think, or beneath easy categorizations. It gets at this nuance. And I think part of this could be seen as this sense of duality, so that mass observation is both a communal writing project and a form of social science research, for example, perhaps, that it is both, that the observers are writing both as sociologists, reporting on the world they see around them, but also very much writing as storytellers, telling the stories of their lives. And so I used the sense of the dual vision to try to look at the writing I got back from mass observation, which was 160 pieces, and probably similar to other people's experience, or maybe different, a mixture from 20 pages to a few lines, from people who loved the topic to people who hated the topic, but always with a lot of passion and generosity of sharing thoughts. So thinking about the observers as researchers or sociologists, there was a very strong message of surprise. This is a surprising topic. I love reading aloud, but no one else does. Or this is a surprising topic. It's the stupidest topic I've ever heard of. Adults and reading aloud don't fit together. And the word realization came up many, many times. I didn't think I read aloud, but the more I think about it, the more I realize I do. Or I didn't think I read aloud, but my partner tells me I do it all the time without realizing it. So it was this sense of realization. And I think mass observation is particularly good at this kind of investigation, because the directive comes through your postbox or email, regardless of your previous interest in the topic. So there's this opportunity to express this surprise. Also, the observers categorized and did forms of analysis in their responses. In terms of the categories that were presented, there was people talking about, oh, I do reading aloud for language learning, I do it for my family purposes, and I do it for writing, or I do reading aloud for my games, for pleasure, and I do it for my work, and I do it for this. So this sense of categorization. Some other kind of headline points that I found interesting for the project was the most common form of reading aloud mentioned across the responses was not reading to children, which is the one that people often think of, but reading social media and newspaper posts. So the kind of breakfast table, oh, listen to this, have you heard this? Can you believe this? Da, 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 da. Not all of the reading to books was to children. A lot was to other adults, partners reading to partners in the bath, in bed, on a park bench. So lots of adults reading to one another. But also not all the reading aloud to other people at all. There's quite a bit of reading aloud to pets, but also a great deal alone. And this was also very striking, that there were people who responded, I don't read aloud because I live alone. How could I? And others who responded, I read aloud because I live alone. I need to hear a voice. I need to use my voice. There was also lots of reading aloud in the workplace, both for very specific roles. So magistrates talking about the importance of reading aloud and the use of eye contact and intonation to convey perhaps a sentence with a certain gravity, or those who did marriage ceremonies, but also kind of slightly more generic, like reading aloud of minutes or editing or PowerPoint slides, a bit like I'm doing now. That's a kind of mixture between reading aloud and discussion. Lots of religious practice. And so this is one area that I think our lives differ a lot. For those who have a religious practice, it's a whole world that is hidden from those who don't, I think. And a lot of work to do with poetry and drama. But correspondents were also responding as storytellers, telling stories of their lives. And these are, in a sense, harder to categorize, and in a way we don't want to categorize them. So I would say, if you have any time to look at the archive and this directive, there were stories that are incredibly moving and very interesting. But nevertheless, there are some categories that I found. So quite a lot about loss and pain. So people reading aloud to friends or family who were dying or in a great deal of pain, when perhaps they wanted to be with someone, use a voice, but there was very little left to say. Also stories I think we could classify about youth and encounter and ideas of memory. And then lots about kind of the everyday life in a partnership. So I've got a few examples here. Can you see that whole thing, or are the pictures obscuring it? And there were many, many examples. There was also someone who had a role in the hospice reading aloud, who shared all the different texts she'd read aloud. But this was certainly something that came up a lot, also in the interviews and the questionnaire, but very strongly from the mass observation responses. Then this, thinking about kind of youth and encounter, I found this made me think a lot, I suppose. So this was someone who was writing this for in an elderly person writing this, remembering something that happened more than 50 years earlier. One of the things that I love about research is you'll ask about a topic and someone will tell you something else, which tells you something so powerful or interesting about life and our lives. And certainly I think we'd all found this with mass observation. So the directive was asking people, do you read out loud? Can you keep a reading out loud diary? And of course, the stories that came back told us a lot about the role that reading aloud played in all kinds of lives. So this was an example, I thought, of the kind of youth encounter, the memory, and then more the everyday life. So there were many examples like this, which are glimpses into people's lives. Reading aloud, perhaps in partnership, the days, the way we spend our evenings. I'm keeping an eye on the time by the side, just as you're reading this. And I'll move on to another one. So a cheese board. So this one I can really picture. Please help yourself. And this is someone describing their spouse of many decades who read that aloud every time it's used. And that seemed to capture, in a way, the beauty and blessings and wonderfulness of having a partner, and also how incredibly annoying it is at times as well, that kind of mixture. That was the mass observation. The other side of the interviews and recording, I was very lucky to have the British Library as a partner. So the recordings are in the sound archive. And there's also extracts on the project website if anyone wants to listen to those. I think the British Library were particularly interested in creating this archive with me because I was traveling around the country and capturing things in different languages and also in different dialects, and they're quite keen to have that captured. Whoops. So as a whole, some of my sense of kind of, so what about the project? And one of the things I wanted to do was create this record. So do adults read aloud? Well, some do for some purposes, and that's at least a start where there wasn't a record at all, strangely enough. But the reading aloud is ubiquitous. It's kind of everywhere, even if not in huge ways. It's incredibly diverse in the purpose, the formation, loud or quiet, with a microphone, not with a microphone, for yourself, for someone else, in the languages used. It also, I think, is part of, I'm thinking about it now as part of kind of rethinking what we might assume with the relationships between the spoken and written language, including where the power is. So some examples of reading aloud, the more powerful option is to seem as if you're speaking spontaneously, whereas you're really reading aloud, like a politician giving a speech. In other instances, like in the court of law or religious context, the power comes from it being very clear that you are reading aloud, and your intonation is designed to show you're reading aloud because the authority is from a kind of higher source, whether it's the law or whether it's something sacred. And that seems to kind of just, as was expressed so well in the previous presentation, to just provide a bit of nuance to the kind of easy givens we think, oh, in our society today, everything's about the written, all the powers with the written. Well, it's not really with the written. There's loads of cases where something needs to be read aloud as well as being written. I also thought a lot about what makes a literacy practice, a reading practice, common, visible, or important. So those examples of people reading aloud to friends in pain, friends dying, these are not everyday occurrences. These are not common in one sense, but they are common culturally, and they're certainly incredibly meaningful. And so if we think about literacies, our literacy teaching, or we might think about what we value as literacy, to think about, well, what makes a literacy practice have an impact in a life. And certainly we can't predict the practices of others. But I think mainly one of the arguments I've been trying to make in different ways across my career is that we need to recognize that reading is a broad umbrella anyway. What counts as reading? What do we include as reading? And we need to keep investigating that. And if we do something like teach reading or work on reading policies, we need to make sure that we bear this in mind as we go through. And work like mass observation is very helpful for that, because it gives us insights from different people in different ways about the forms of literacy that they take part in and that are meaningful or frightening or upsetting or a range of things. Whoops, sorry, I've done something with this. So that's me just about finished. I just wanted to leave with, that's a project website if anyone is interested. There's a lot more information there on the publications and also those sound clips. This is the book that was kindly mentioned. There was an article purely about the mass observation, so there's more there. And then this earlier article was a pilot study that this is all really based on. But I think I will end there and I'll stop sharing and hand over to Pollyanna Reese, and I look forward to questions or discussion afterwards.